Good morning, y'all. So I have my mic here to try to help you hear me better and me not have to strain, which hopefully gets my voice back sooner, which means I'm back in person Monday. But I always feel like I should be doing some sort of podcast where I'm talking about a serial killer. But it exists. It's going to help. So we're going to use that. So as people sign in, let me just go over a couple things. Since our wrench has been thrown into our schedule. Thank you again, as always, for your understanding, support, all that good stuff. I've literally never had to cancel class before because I was sick. And it was just, I opened my mouth Wednesday and nothing came out. So like there was no way I could teach you guys. I've also been coughing and I just didn't feel like I wanted to cough on you guys even through 2 masks. So thank you all. And I appreciate again the flexibility and the general awesomeness that I see from you all the time. So just to look over our syllabus here real quick, and let me zoom so you all can see it a little better. All right, so we did get through our bias in science. So now we're on our how to lie with statistics, and it is obviously we're like a day behind. That's okay. Next week is how to lie with tables and charts. It will have its own PowerPoint, but it'll sort of follow from this. And if we need to like give a day of that up from the integrity and psychological thought, we can do that, no problem. Your next exam is the 10th, which is, I'm just checking the actual day of the week. It's a Wednesday. And again, if we haven't gotten through all the material by then, we can easily move that. I'm going to be flexible with everything. The other thing I wanted to do real quick before we dive into our lecture today is to remind you of some stuff that's floating around Blackboard that you may have sort of forgotten about. So there is a section for the assignments we've been doing in class. So like if you never got a chance to do the initial one about sources for your topic, it's here. If you haven't gotten a chance to do the one about bias and sources, it's here. And then I have also put the group ones we did so people can refer back to them, or if you missed them, you can, basically clear out the answers and submit it yourself. And then especially the APA reference one, just so you have some nice examples of that. Trying to think if there's anything else. Again, keeping up. That's not really words, but you know what I mean with the perusals. And if you can remember it all, if you're not, no big deal. But click the actual assignment to get to it. If you click at the top, it won't connect it to Blackboard for some reason. It's easy enough. I just type it into Blackboard. But it just makes it that much easier. And then remember, especially the perusals that don't have a chapter with them, we're often gonna have multiple parts. Like today's had multiple shortish articles, right? So make sure when you get to the bottom of the first reading, you're clicking into like go on to the next part of the assignment, because I think some people have been missing that. Any questions before we get started on anything? Awesome. Well, like I said, we're going to start talking about how to lie with statistics. And I will definitely turn the captions on because I feel like everybody needs them, maybe including me today. I don't know. I think you all will appreciate, because we know that these aren't perfect, that I've used this feature in a presentation to the faculty earlier in the week. And it had some fun typos while I was doing that. Like I said, I was going to the December something conference and it said the December sex conference, which is not what I'm going to. They probably exist, but not what I'm doing. So I thought you all would find that amusing, since you see it mess up every day. So this is about how you can take statistics I love that someone laughed. Thank you. And use them in well-meaning ways. You don't even have to be trying to like manipulate your data or do something shady. Um, and come up with different answers just based on your data analysis. And there are people who do shady things. We kind of talked about some of them already, like Brian Wansink and some of the other folks. But typically it's really just people trying their best. And everyone kind of has a different favorite strategy for analyzing data. This is something I actually saw on Twitter the other day, and on the thread of it, another professor had said, "Oh, I used this in class as an example." And I was like, that is a fantastic idea. So I decided to also do this. You'll see a lot of these types of stories. And sorry, I am going to sound like I'm going through puberty at times, so apologies for the occasional high squeak. But you see a lot of these types of stories about basically like shaming millennials and zennials. They're like, Kyle has already paid off his student loans. He owns his own home and he's going to prepare to retire at age 40. Managing your spending is difficult, he says. If I can do it, anyone can. Well, and then you read the story and you see he got his first job at a company run by his father, making $250,000 a year. What most of us will probably never see in our lifetimes in terms of salary, right? And he lived in his grandfather's empty vacation home to build up we all have access to that clearly. Rather than borrow a mortgage on a house, he used his saving and a $500,000 gift from his uncle. It was tempting to spend. My friends would send me photos of vacations from Italy or Japan, but I remain committed to only vacationing domestically. I don't know about you all, but I haven't actually like vacationed in years. Domestically, right? I travel a decent amount when it's not COVID time for conferences, but those are for conferences, right? So I think that it's important to keep in mind that even things like this the Telegraph is a pretty reputable newspaper in Great Britain. And the fact that they still can be very misleading, I think is really important to keep in mind. And I'm going to mute real quick so I can blow my nose and not blow your eardrum. Alrighty, so I have a couple videos that I've interspersed throughout this. And I put these in before I even lost my voice, so just something to punch it up. And so this first one's just an introduction to how statistics can be misleading in general.
Statistics are persuasive, so much so that people, organizations, and whole countries base some of their most important decisions on organized data. But there's a problem with that. Any set of statistics might have something lurking inside it, something that can turn the results completely upside down. For example, imagine you need to choose between two hospitals for an elderly relative's surgery. Out of each hospital's last 1,000 patients, 900 survived at Hospital A, while only 800 survived at Hospital B. So it looks like Hospital A is the better choice. But before you make your decision, remember that not all patients arrive at the hospital with the same level of health. And if we divide each hospital's last 1,000 patients into those who arrived in good health and those who arrived in poor health, the picture starts to look very different. Hospital A had only 100 patients who arrived in poor health, of which 30 survived. But Hospital B had 400, and they were able to save 210. So Hospital B is the better choice for patients who arrive at hospital in poor health, with a survival rate of 52.5%. And what if your relative's health is good when she arrives at the hospital? Strangely enough, Hospital B is still the better choice, with a survival rate of over 98%. So how can Hospital A have a better overall survival rate if Hospital B has better survival rates for patients in each of the two groups? What we've stumbled upon is a case of Simpson's paradox, where the same set of data can appear to show opposite trends depending on how it's grouped. This often occurs when aggregated data hides a conditional variable, sometimes known as a lurking variable, which is a hidden additional factor that significantly influences results. Here, the hidden factor is the relative proportion of patients who arrive in good or poor health. Simpson's paradox isn't just a hypothetical scenario. It pops up from time to time in the real world, sometimes in important contexts. One study in the UK appeared to show that smokers had a higher survival rate than non-smokers over a 20-year time period. That is, until dividing the participants by age group showed that the non-smokers were significantly older on average, and thus more likely to die during the trial period, precisely because they were living longer in general. Here, the age groups are the lurking variable and are vital to correctly interpret the data. In another example, an analysis of Florida's death penalty cases seemed to reveal no racial disparity in sentencing between black and white defendants convicted of murder. But dividing the cases by the race of the victim told a different story. In either situation, black defendants were more likely to be sentenced to death. The slightly higher overall sentencing rate for white defendants was due to the fact that cases with white victims were more likely to elicit a death sentence than cases where the victim was black, and most murders occurred between people of the same race. So how do we avoid falling for the paradox? Unfortunately, there is no one-size-fits-all answer. Data can be grouped and divided in any number of ways, and overall numbers may sometimes give a more accurate picture than data divided into misleading or arbitrary categories. All we can do is carefully study the actual situations the statistics describe and consider whether lurking variables may be present. Otherwise, we leave ourselves vulnerable to those who would use data to manipulate others and promote their own agendas.
Yeah, that statistic about if you kill a white person, you're more likely to be sentenced to death kind of made me think of the Kyle what's his butt name case in Minnesota. He's the guy who went up and shot protesters, and the judge in that case decreed they're not allowed to call them victims. They can call them rioters or looters. So real objective, right? There's racial bias in a lot of the American legal system. All right, this next one is actually Bill Gates, and he has a little book club, which I had no idea until I was prepping for this. And he's just going to briefly talk about the book that your first reading for today talked about, which the book is actually called How to Lie with Statistics. So.
Every summer, I try to do a little extra reading. Here's a few books I've read recently that you might enjoy. How to Lie with Statistics by Daryl Huff. Being able to understand what you're looking at and being willing to say, hey, where did that come from? Is that accurate? Being able to understand what you're looking at and being willing to say, hey, where did that come from? Is that accurate? It's a quick read. It's got a lot of good examples in it. It's a trip to the past, even though the basic points it makes are still as valid today. On Immunity by Eula Biss.
Okay, so that's the whole thing. Really brief, but it's a one I've heard. I've actually never read it myself. This kind of makes me want to read it, but quick read, and the article that you looked at is a good summary of it. So. Lessons on How to Lie with Statistics was the first reading on your perusal assignment. So one of the things they talk about is data literacy, right? So we've been talking a lot about like scientific literacy, versus science literacy. And they talked about data literacy, and that's a big part of what we want you to be able to do from this class too, is not necessarily be able to analyze, do statistics yourself, although certainly, again, if you go the sort of research route, either with the BS, in psych or just choosing to do 480 within the VA, you will do that. But the ability to read statistics and data, understand what that is saying, right? Argue with it, right? Is it something that you see a flaw in, right? And a lot of times we do see those, or it's just something like we would do that a different way, and make decisions based on that data, right? So some of you may be wanting to eventually go into government or be part of nonprofits. Oftentimes in those cases, you're being presented with data, a chart, statistics, right? And then you have to help make decisions based on that data that's in front of you. So again, we want to base this all on data. Correlation does not equal causation. We're just going to keep saying it over and over and over, right? And again, the reason I keep drilling this is not because I think you all are not going to get it. I just think like nobody gets this. And as I've mentioned previously, even existing scientists who should know better sometimes slip into causal language when they're describing results of a correlational study. So you should view correlations in general with skepticism. It doesn't mean they're not good, and it doesn't mean that they're not helpful. It just means we should be aware of things like how were these things measured, who was taking it, and what are all the possible explanations. So again, if we're correlating X and Y, it could be that X causes Y. It could be that Y causes X, or it could be a third variable Z is affecting both X and Y. In that first video, they were describing lurking variables, and I threw in the chat that that's a third variable, or sometimes called a confounding variable, or just a confound. These are all terms for the same thing. It's also possible, even if P is less than 0.05, right? You still got a 5% chance that this happened by chance and X and Y aren't actually related, right? And so that's something we always need to keep in the back of our minds as well. So we need higher level studies to determine causality. So cohort studies are those longitudinal studies where you would follow people over many years and see, you know, if you have this happen at time 1, what happens at time 2, what happens at time 3. And then the randomized control trials, the controlled experiments, right, where you can control as much as you can and see if X actually does affect Y when you manipulate X. That allows you to control for those confounds. I really like this way of describing it. Relationships don't last forever. I mean, certainly some do, right? But not all. And, you know, even if you find a correlation in one particular circumstances in one particular data set, it doesn't mean that it's true in all circumstances, right? It could be true just for your particular sample, which, as we've discussed previously, in the US in particular, tends to be white, middle class college students, right? So that doesn't mean that that's going to apply to people of different ages, different races, different ethnicities, nationalities, etc. We're also always looking at a limited region of each variable, right? And some of that is just, again, who's in our sample and how they're responding. So for example, I don't know if this is still the case, but when I first got here and was supervising Psych 480 projects, a lot of people were looking at self-esteem as a variable. And for some reason, VWU students just had a really high self-esteem, which is awesome. That's a real positive thing, but meant we didn't really have a lot of variability in the self-esteem concept to look at when we were, say, doing correlations, for example. You know, and again, you can also be limited just by the measures you're using, right? You can have a floor effect where it's missing sort of the bottom variability. You can have a ceiling effect where it's missing, you know, the variability beyond that. So there's a lot of limitations because in psychology, we have to kind of come at things sideways, diagonally, crisscross, right? Because we can't just like magically scan someone's brain and know where they are on depression or self-esteem that day. And then a big thing is not making generalization errors, right? And this is something that you're taught really clearly in graduate school. And before that, if you're ever writing up results, like one of the most important parts of your discussion section is the limitations and just acknowledging, hey, this can't necessarily be generalized beyond the type of sample I used, right? And even like college students at a small liberal arts institution could vary depending on where in the country they are. So for example, I've collected data with some of my former professors at Kenyon College, which is in the middle of Ohio. And then I've collected data here, right? So we've collaborated. And the Kenyon students are slightly different on things than the VWU students. And part of that is probably that we have more racial diversity here. I think another big part is that we're near the beach, right? And that lends itself to a different level of seeing your body, right, displayed if you're a beachgoer, as opposed to in Ohio where you can wear sweaters a lot of the year, right? So it's a little different. We've talked about this before, right? Always looking at the axes on the table or chart. The author of this original book says the y-axis should always start at 0. From what I've read, looking this over and looking for videos for class today, this is controversial. There are definitely people who disagree with this statement. I think that, and what I've been taught is, you do the 0, but then you can do the like 2 little slashes on the y-axis that indicate that there's a break before you get to the value that makes sense. Otherwise, again, like imagine looking at a chart that has 1,000 is the high, right? It could be really hard depending on how much variability there is, right? To put that, like, we're limited. It's either going to be super tiny or like take up a giant poster board size piece of paper, right? Also beware of small samples. We've mentioned this in the past, especially for these more expensive studies like brain scans, like randomized controlled trials for therapies. We often see fairly small sample sizes, 20 people or 20 people per group. And so you can get shocking statistics just because if you've got like 1 or 2 quirky people in your data set, it makes the whole data set look a little more like those quirky people, right? So you get these extreme values. And that's why meta-analyses are so important. I think I keep driving this home over and over throughout the semester, but they really allow you to take a step back and look at the data over, tens or hundreds of studies to see what are the overall prevailing patterns. Also, we want to think about things like we talked about before the previous exam, like regression to the mean, right? Thinking about that. So we also want to look at all the numbers. We need to figure out important things about the data set that may not be provided, right? What do we need to know about these people, how it was collected, right? Things along those lines. And we also need to remember that a single number is never going to be adequate to describe a data set. And yet oftentimes that's what you'll see reported, right? Is like one correlation or a like percentage. The news loves to get a hold of like things that were measured on a Likert scale and then say, 50% of people answered like strongly agree or higher or something, right? And it goes up to definitely agree. And so it's like, it's a weird way to look at continuous data to sort of chop it like that. But you see that a lot, just I think because it's a way people can digest it. Another important thing that I hadn't really thought about, because when I hear average, I just think mean, right? Because that's what I've always been taught, is the arithmetic mean is your average. Is to think about when they say average, what are they actually meaning? Again, it should be the mean, but sometimes when they talk about average, they might use the median. middlemost number, right? Rather than the arithmetic average. Or they might use the mode, which is the most frequently occurring value. And those don't have the same meaning as that arithmetic average, right? So the example they give here is if you were to look at the mean income in the US versus the median income in the US, they differ by $16,000, which is like some people's whole salary for a year, right? Like that's a huge difference. When I was in grad school, I made less than that, right? Because I just had an assistantship. So, you know, it shows like how important it is to be precise and know what we're actually talking about. We also want to compare to a common baseline. So we want to make sure we're using the same previous value or starting value. And we want to put this in context. So one of the things that happens when you have a preschooler is you fall down holes of animal videos. And recently I did this with blue whale videos, and these were like mind-boggling to me. So I'm going to start with a video that's actually called How Big is a Blue Whale? And then we're going to go on to some other information from that. So I don't know about you all, but I have no idea how big a blue whale is from that video. There were no context clues around it. You know, we didn't get a full view of the blue whale's body, right? So that's not really that helpful. But there are other better things out there to think about how big a blue whale is. So this is the size of a blue whale's body, and this is the size of, I believe, a 747. Right, so imagine how large an airplane is and kind of think of that. And again, give me just a second, I'm going to blow my nose and try not to blast out your ear. Or it's 3 London double-decker buses. It's the same length as if you put 5 elephants, right, Tacey? I mean, this is the rabbit hole I fell down, where I was like, what? It's like amazing and terrifying. And basically, like, there's a video I've watched that's like 28 minutes long, so I didn't want to make you all fall down that rabbit hole with me. But like one of the things they talked about is essentially because they're in water and because they have that buoyancy support, it allows them to grow that big. It shows you, you know, like how many divers would it take? And I believe this one is about its weight. So it weighs as much as 4 747s. And then this one I thought was even more helpful. And this is a lot of what the video I watched got into. So this is Brachiosaurus. So if you were a dinosaur kid growing up, you kind of think of the sauropods, these big herbivorous dinosaurs, as like the biggest things that have ever walked the earth. Nope. Right, the blue whale is longer, the blue whale weighed more, you know, whatever rubric you used. If you think about something like the T-Rex, again, we think of it, especially from things like Jurassic Park, as this like giant predator, the king of everything, bigger than anything. Nope. Right, compared to the blue whale, not so much. Things like a woolly mammoth. It's interesting they're showing Triceratops with like spikes on it. I haven't actually heard of that. Now I'm gonna have to fall down a rabbit hole about that. Something like the megalodon, you may have seen nature shows where they talk about the megalodon was the largest shark ever to live, right? Okay. Right, in comparison. Okay. And you know, for a lot of us who grew up maybe going to SeaWorld or watching things about orca whales like Free Willy, before we knew how horrible those things are, after watching things like Blackfish, right? Orcas are kind of a point of reference, and they're like dwindled, right? As are great white sharks. So if we think of great white sharks as being giant, 20, 25 feet long, I mean, it looks insignificant almost compared to the blue whale, right? So blue whales can grow to be 100 feet long. I just like, as much as I've looked at stuff like this, I cannot wrap my head around how large it is. Like JC was saying, it's terrifying, but so fascinating. And like their heart has to be giant, as you could imagine. And then like, here's us. I think this is probably like average size human, 6 feet, 5'10". Yeah, insignificant. The nice thing is, if you're not familiar, blue whales are baleen eaters. So they only eat krill, like teeny tiny shrimp and algae and things like that. So we're actually never in any danger from them other than them maybe accidentally swallowing us. This actually happened fairly recently with a humpback whale, where it accidentally swallowed a diver, but it spit it back out right away because it doesn't want to eat that, because humpbacks use the same type of feeding. So it's really interesting that a lot of these really large animals, so like whale sharks, which are not on here, but are the largest current living shark, also docile, also is something that feeds on these sort of microscopic things. So again, context matters, right? It helps to have a point of reference, and you can imagine that for anything else, right? So if I told you, well, this person scored a 12 on depression. If you think the scale's out of 10, you're like, holy shiz, right? But if you realize the scale is out of 50, you're like, maybe that person's actually doing okay, right? So you need that context, you need those baselines, you need like cutoff points or points of comparison. And I've kind of hinted at this already. Look for bias in sample selection. How were participants recruited? We've talked about this before, right? If they're recruited by landline, you're going to miss a lot of, households like mine where we don't have a landline, and haven't in like 11 years, something like that, since we moved to Virginia. If you're doing it online, you're going to miss people who don't have access to the internet. And so they talk a lot, and we've seen this in other articles, but I just love the term. And I know from perusal, several of you do as well, the term weird bias. So we tend to get Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic countries. And then, if we kind of think about just sort of this part, we get that even within the US, for example. Also, one of the things they point out that I think is really important, and like, again, people with PhDs who publish research are also guilty of this at times, is to think about like the sources they're citing in their introduction and their discussion, right? That shows a little bit of bias because they're more likely to pull out sources that agree with their hypothesis, that agree with their findings, or their beliefs, right? So people who are trying to be unbiased will often try to show that variability. So for example, when I did my master's thesis, I was looking at how feminist beliefs related to things like body image. And at that time, there wasn't much data out there about that. So I showed like, well, these types of studies show that it is related, and these types of studies find no relation, and kind of to point out like, we need more research, we need better methods. And I could make an argument that I was, in my mind, choosing a better method. And it's a method I've used consistently since then, and seems pretty consistent. So yeah, we really need to think about those things, when we're digesting studies that we're reading. Where are these people coming from? Who is missing, right? A lot of times there's little to no data collected on sub-Saharan Africa, for example, with the exception of maybe South Africa, because it's sort of westernized in and of itself, right? We're getting more data out of China now, which is great, but like India, other Southeast Asian countries, we often don't see a lot from there. South America as well. So we're missing whole swaths of the Earth's population where we're just assuming the stuff we find in North America and Europe applies when it, again, might not, right? We also want to scrutinize authority. Again, like, try not to, this is hard even as psychologists, like, try not to be too bowled over by big names. we've talked, and your book is using the example of Daryl Bem, who is really well respected in the area of gender research, but like decided that he thought ESP was a thing and like started to study that, and like it's not. And even if you look at his data, it's still not right. But because he's this big name, it could give more credibility. There have also been big names, unfortunately, in the past who've been paid to lie. And in particular, we see this in the realm of psychiatry. Not that psychologists are immune, but they're much more likely, based on legal things, to be the ones prescribing medication. The psychologists can only do so in a couple states with additional degrees. And so they are much more likely to perhaps fall prey to the seduction of the big pharma companies. So there's a really good documentary on HBO, I'm not gonna be able to remember the name of, but about the opioid epidemic and how doctors were manipulated into overprescribing it, basically. Or there were cigarette makers paid doctors to say smoking wasn't harmful. And in every profession, there are unethical people who want to make a buck. By the time I got to the Medical College of Georgia in 2009, 2010, they actually had a policy that they wouldn't take any money, food, anything from pharmaceutical reps, because the previous chair of the department had been getting research money from big pharma. And sometimes they do fund research, which is good. We need research funded, right? Especially if they agree that the researcher can publish the results no matter what. But this guy was just pocketing it. Basically, it was like a supplemental income. Not cool. Obviously, he was not there anymore. He was not practicing medicine anymore. And the policy was revised within the whole department. We want to make sure we read the science or the study itself and see, is the science sound? Not just be like, ooh, well, this is from big name X and therefore it must be perfect, right? Authorities should have to prove themselves just like anyone else. Authorities should have to follow all the steps just like anyone else. My undergraduate advisors are actually more famous in the area of eating disorders in some ways than my graduate advisor. I just happened to stumble upon these wonderful people at Kenyon, Michael Levine and Linda Smolak, both of whom are now retired. But like they would go through the peer review process just like anybody else. I remember one time I was presenting with them at a conference and we had to wait just like anybody else for like the previous group to filter out of our room. And it was like a women in psychology conference, and Michael went and kind of stuck his head in the room and he was like, that's the least feminist thing I've ever done, trying to intimidate this room full of women. And we're like, we know you weren't actually trying to intimidate them, because I don't know that you could. But yeah, so like a true authority should be glad to jump through hoops and prove themselves and make sure their data is sound. Alrighty, the second article kind of repeats some of the same themes, but I just love the title, The 7 Deadly Sins of Statistical Misinterpretation. Again, I feel like I should be on NPR with this silly mic, but hey, hopefully it's helping you hear me better. So, again, talking about small differences, not only small sample sizes, but here looking at potentially things that are statistically significant, but might not be that clinically significant, right? So you could have a statistically significant difference if you have a large enough sample where it's like one group scores an average of 4.5 and the other group scores an average of 4.3, right? Is that actually meaningful? And another thing they talk about in this article, and they have some great diagrams, is to check the margin of error. And so again, good people who are providing data will include error bars on their graphs to show like essentially the standard deviation or standard error of the mean. And if those overlap between your two groups, and especially if they overlap substantially, like it doesn't mean anything. It's like when political polls are in a statistical dead heat, right? Where the margin of error is larger than the difference between the two. I think we might be there actually with Virginia's gubernatorial race, so make sure you vote on Tuesday. Statistical versus clinical significance kind of goes along with that. Sometimes they call this real world significance, which I also like. So they talk about looking at the effect size, which is really important. This is a rubric that allows you to compare data between different types of articles. It's often the statistics that's used within a meta-analysis, for example. And then you also, beyond just looking at the numbers, want to take like 3 steps back and say, how does this actually practically affect the people who are experiencing it? And so there's another short video about this that I wanted to share.
Statistical significance is not the same as clinical significance. That's the take-home message of a recent study looking at the outcomes of past cardiovascular trials. Researchers should look beyond point estimates from statistical tests when reporting clinical trial results, say the authors. Instead, the range of possible results, as defined by confidence intervals, should be considered when making clinical recommendations. Investigators often use statistical tests to decide if an outcome is significant. For example, does a medication significantly improve patients' health compared to a placebo? Does a new surgical technique lead to a significantly better outcome than the treatment currently being used? In the literature, the answer to these questions is often given as a p-value, a single figure indicating how meaningful the results are. But what happens when the effects of a treatment being considered fail to show a significant result? Should physicians shy away from these therapies? Not necessarily, suggest the researchers. Such treatments may still have clinical relevance. Sifting through thousands of published clinical studies, the team of Canadian researchers focused on cardiovascular trials, comparing study design, p-values, and primary outcome findings. They found that almost 3/4 of trials reported a non-statistically significant result. According to the new study, however, 60% of these cases had potentially important clinical implications, despite statistical analyses finding them to be non-significant. Just because a medical treatment does not reach statistical significance does not rule out the possibility that it may be beneficial or harmful. By failing to look beyond p-values, researchers run the risk of missing potentially useful results. The fix? The research team suggests authors of future studies take a broad view in which all data, including potentially meaningful effects, are considered when making clinical recommendations.
So sorry, those closed captions were like a weird mix of German and English. Not sure why, but hopefully you could hear it okay. So yeah, it does matter when we need to look beyond that because, you know, even if there's not, sorry, that was probably really loud for y'all. Even if there's not a statistically significant difference, right, there still could be important implications for people who try to take, say, a medication or a surgery procedure. The other thing we need to think about is the extremes, right? So we often think of outliers in our data as things that we just want to get rid of, check them out. There's not, but if we take that and we extrapolate that out and think about psychology in particular, for example, like if we were to take out all the people who are extreme in some way, we would be getting rid of people who experience psychopathology. Right. And that's a big part of what psychology has studied over the years and tries to treat and help people with and prevent. So that's a really vital part. And we don't want to chuck people out just because they happen to be schizophrenic when we're talking about something like hallucinations. Right. So that's really important, is to think about, you know, rather than just following statistical rules, thinking about, why might these people be outliers? And is that important actually in my data set? I kind of liked this idea of maybe sometimes trusting coincidence. Sometimes results are just a fluke. We've talked about this a lot with illusory or spurious correlations. Just because two things happen at the same time or have the similar patterns doesn't mean they're related or causes of one another, right? That like coincidences are often just coincidences, but sometimes it is a thing and can be affected in, you know, by maybe multiple confounds in ways that we haven't thought about. So we need to investigate that. They talk about getting causation backwards, that we don't want to only think about causation in one direction if we're doing a correlation, right? Because it could be either way. And then for getting to and consider those third variables, those confounding variables, those extraneous variables, those lurking variables. It's all the same word for the same, it's all different words for the same thing. Always think about what else could be at play. And again, silly little video, but gets at some of these concepts in a nice way, I think.
As epidemiologists, one of our main objectives is to investigate relationships between exposures and health in populations. However, once identified, our challenge is to determine whether this relationship represents a causal pathway. In other words, does the exposure truly cause the outcome? If we're not careful, we may incorrectly conclude that causal association between two factors exists. This occurs because the association we observe is distorted by another factor that we have not considered. We call this distorting factor a confounding variable. Confounding is one of the most important problems in epidemiologic studies because it results in spurious or distorted associations being observed. A classic example of confounding involves the investigation of an association between carrying matches and lung cancer, where researchers concluded that people who carry matches are more likely to develop lung cancer. This is, of course, not the correct root cause. The factor not considered here is smoking status. Smokers are more likely to carry matches and more likely to develop lung cancer. But since smoking status wasn't considered, it appeared as though carrying matches was the exposure that led to a higher likelihood of developing lung cancer. So we would say that smoking status confounds the relationship observed between carrying matches and developing lung cancer. As epidemiologists, we must carefully consider what factors might potentially confound results. And when an association is observed, we must assess whether a confounding relationship exists. To do this, we consider whether a potential confounding variable meets three criteria. The confounding variable must 1. Be associated with exposure of interest, 2. Be associated with the outcome of interest, and 3. Not be a result or caused by the exposure of interest. This final criterion is about temporality. In other words, which of these exposures came first? If the factor in question meets all three of these criteria, it is considered a confounder. It can be helpful to draw the factors of interest out in what's called a causal map, and then work through the three criteria. A causal map is a bit like a timeline, where time moves from left to right. We put the exposures on the left and the outcome on the far right. We then consider whether the potential confounding variable would sensibly occur before or after the exposure, and place it on the map accordingly. Let's try an example. Say we're interested in the relationship between getting the flu vaccine and the likelihood of getting the flu in the same season. Now we're concerned that participants' occupation, such as being a health professional, might confound this relationship. On our causal map, we place occupation furthest left on the diagram because it precedes getting a flu vaccine. Now we investigate for confounding by first asking, is the potential confounder associated with the exposure? In this example, yes, health professionals are more likely to get the flu vaccine to decrease their chances of getting the flu. Next we ask, is the potential confounder associated with the outcome? In this example, yes, health professionals are more likely to get the flu because they are exposed to high numbers of sick people. Finally, we ask, is the potential confounder caused by or a result of the exposure? In this case, the answer is obviously no. One does not become a health professional because they receive the flu vaccine. Therefore, we can conclude that occupation is a confounding variable of this relationship. Confounding can be a major source of bias in epidemiologic studies, bias that leads to spurious conclusions about a given relationship. Therefore, it's crucial that we critically evaluate the associations we observe, using the three criteria for a confounding variable and causal mapping to ensure that we are aware of potential confounders and address them within our studies.
So obviously that was made by an epidemiologist, but clearly would also apply to psychology or other sciences that are dealing with people, or, it honestly confounds can come in any type of study. So we need to think, I really like that example because it's like, it shows causality so clearly. Like getting the flu shot does not magically make you a healthcare provider, right? Like people who go to med school would be like, that would be nice if I could just like get injected and skip those 4 years, right? So it's a really nice way to look at thinking through causality in a clear way and thinking about what compounds are. Okie dokie. Like I said, hopefully this will all be out of my system on Monday and we'll be able to meet in person. Thank you, thank you, thank you for being willing to be flexible, and don't leave just yet because I'm going to do a screenshot of the participants. So that'll be my attendance for today. Boom, I got it. All right. Have a good weekend, y'all. Stick around for a minute in case anyone has questions.